Joe Braven, a hard-working family guy and lumberjack, is busy loading logs onto a truck, making sure they're properly secured. When he notices a storm approaching, he quickly tells the driver, Weston, to take off before the weather gets worse. Back at home, Joe is warmly greeted by his wife, Stephanie, and their young daughter, Charlotte. The family decides to go out together, and during their outing, Joe meets up with his father, Lyndon, who is struggling with dementia and often seems confused. That evening, Joe spends time with Charlotte, reading her a bedtime story, though he seems distracted. Once she's asleep, he starts looking around the house for Lyndon, only to realize he's missing. Meanwhile, Lyndon, lost and disoriented, wanders into the street and ends up inside a bar. Joe gets a call informing him that his father has shown up there again, so he rushes over. When he arrives, he finds Lyndon being harassed by 3 men. Without hesitation, Joe steps in to defend him, taking down 2 of the guys with well-aimed punches. During the fight, Lyndon gets hit on the head. Joe keeps fighting and manages to overpower the men, but a cop soon arrives, breaking up the scuffle. He warns Joe that if something like this happens again, he'll have to arrest them both. At the hospital, a doctor stitches up Lyndon and informs Joe that his father's condition has significantly worsened over the past year. He suggests that Joe consider placing Lyndon in a nursing home, but Joe isn't having it. While in the hospital room, the reality of Lyndon's deteriorating memory becomes painfully clear when he fails to recognize Charlotte. Meanwhile, Weston, the truck driver, heads to a meeting with a man named Hallett. Using a forklift, Hallett tampers with the truck's cargo while Weston stands guard. Later, the 2 of them are in the truck together when Hallett questions Weston about bringing others into their little operation. Weston refuses, insisting he just wants to get paid and be done with it. Suddenly, they lose control of the truck and crash down a small hill. Dazed but unharmed, they climb out. Hallett orders Weston to grab an axe and crack open a log that fell off during the crash. As Weston starts chopping, the truck suddenly explodes, sending both men into shock. Ignoring the blast, Hallett urges Weston to keep cutting, and inside the log, they find a hidden stash of drugs. With their truck destroyed, they decide to hide the drugs in Joe's remote cabin, which is nearby. Meanwhile, back at Joe's house, he's up late at night, stressed and chopping wood at 1 a.m. His wife tries to comfort him, but he tells her he's not ready to put his dad in a nursing home. She suggests he take Lyndon to their cabin for a few days to figure things out. Weston and Hallett successfully stash the drugs at Joe's cabin, feeling confident no one will find them. They head back to the crash site and call the cops to make it seem like an accident. Later, they check into a motel where Hallett contacts his boss, Casson, to report what happened. Casson, a ruthless criminal, is in the middle of a tense meeting when he receives the call. Without hesitation, he tells Hallett to stay put, promising to handle the situation himself. As he ends the call, he violently slams a man's head into a table, showing just how dangerous he is. The next morning, Joe tells Lyndon they're heading to the cabin to close it up for the winter. Charlotte begs to come along, but Joe says no, which upsets her. As Joe and his father drive off, Casson and his crew arrive at the motel, pick up Hallett and Weston, and head toward the cabin. At the cabin, Joe and Lyndon get a fire going and bring in some firewood. Joe tries to talk to his father about his worsening condition, but Lyndon gets defensive and storms out of the cabin in anger. At the same time, Casson and his men reach the area but keep their distance for now. Weston warns them that Joe might be inside, but Casson doesn't care. He orders his men to block all possible escape routes and move in. Inside the garage, Joe senses something is off. As he looks around, he finds an unfamiliar bag filled with drugs. Before he can make sense of it, Charlotte unexpectedly shows up, surprising him. Realizing the danger, Joe quickly decides they need to get out of there. As they drive away, one of Casson's snipers, Essington, takes aim, waiting for the perfect shot. But before he can pull the trigger, Joe, sensing the threat, turns the car around and heads back to the cabin. Casson's men surround the cabin and park their vehicles outside. Seeing this, Lyndon grabs a rifle, preparing to defend his family. Joe hides Charlotte under the stairs and then rushes to the garage to try and call for help over the radio. Casson orders Weston to bring Joe out, and Joe, knowing he's outnumbered, complies. He approaches Casson, tossing the bag of drugs at his feet. But Hallett immediately points out that it's not all of it. Thinking fast, Joe tells them he'll give them the rest in town, warning that Lyndon will burn whatever's left if they don't let them go. Casson, however, has other plans. He reveals that Weston gave him all of Joe's personal details, including his family's names. While Weston pleads with Joe, Casson suddenly shoots him in the head, killing him instantly. He then orders Joe to fetch the remaining drugs. Joe heads inside, instructing his father to get Charlotte out safely while he stays behind to deal with the attackers. Grabbing a bow and arrows, he sets up an ambush. He signals to his father, who takes out one of the men with a sniper rifle. At the same time, Joe tricks another thug into inspecting a decoy bag before shooting him with an arrow. With the enemies distracted, Joe jumps onto an ATV, taking the real bag of drugs with him to lure them away. After riding for a while, Joe stops and helps Charlotte hide in a safe spot, instructing her to climb to the mountain peak to get a phone signal and call her mother. He then takes off again, expertly maneuvering to evade his pursuers. Casson, listening carefully to the fading sound of the ATV, figures out that Joe is circling back toward the cabin. He orders his men to regroup while he finds a good sniping position. Joe's plan hits a snag when Casson gets a clear shot and fires, hitting him in the back. Losing control, Joe crashes the ATV. One of Casson's men catches up to him, but when he checks the bag and realizes it's another decoy, Joe ambushes him, ready to fight for survival. During the intense brawl, Joe manages to turn the tables, restraining his opponent with a rope before riding the ATV off a cliff, sending the man plummeting while he himself crashes into the water below. Meanwhile, Charlotte frantically calls her mother, informing her about the danger and telling her to meet at Lookout Boulder. The call is abruptly cut off, prompting her panicked mother to contact the sheriff, who warns her to stay away while he and his deputy rush to the scene. Joe pulls himself out of the water and hurries back toward the cabin. From his vantage point, Casson spots his fallen men and immediately orders his remaining forces to storm the cabin and wipe out anyone inside. As Joe climbs up the mountain, one of Casson's men, Clay, is sent to intercept him. But Joe stumbles upon their vehicle and overhears their invasion plan through the radio. Thinking fast, he sabotages the car and makes a run for it. Back at the cabin, Howlett picks up a fallen firearm and heads toward the house. Lyndon, hearing someone approaching, fires a shot through the wall, just barely missing Howlett. In retaliation, Howlett fires back, but also fails to hit his target. Without his rifle, Lyndon grabs a pair of ski poles and waits at the door. The moment Howlett steps inside, Lyndon stabs him in the foot, and they engage in a brutal struggle that ends with Howlett fatally wounded. Regaining his rifle, Lyndon moves upstairs. Meanwhile, Clay tracks Joe through the forest, but Joe cleverly climbs up a tree and catches Clay off guard, taking his gun. As Joe races back to the cabin, Casson fires at him from behind. Inside, Casson's sniper, Essington, lines up a shot on Lyndon and grazes his head, injuring him. With Clay and Casson closing in, Joe reaches the cabin and returns fire, wounding Essington. Casson and his crew unleash a barrage of bullets at the house, forcing Joe to shield his confused father. Eventually, the attackers retreat momentarily, giving Joe the chance to take his father to the garage, instructing him to stay hidden. Nearby, Stephanie arrives, retrieves a bow from her car, and begins climbing the mountain. Charlotte, attempting to reach her mother, is spotted and chased by one of Casson's men. Stephanie, acting fast, shoots an arrow into the attacker's hand, and then lands a hit on his head. Despite this, he overpowers her, but she fights back fiercely, stabbing him repeatedly before making her escape. Inside the cabin, Casson, Clay, and Essington reload and prepare for another assault. Joe, anticipating their move, heats a metal rod in the fire and waits. As Essington storms in, Joe sears his face with the burning rod and drags him inside. When Clay enters, Joe hurls a flaming axe at him, then douses him with alcohol, setting both Clay and part of the cabin on fire. Meanwhile, Charlotte reaches the road, where the sheriff and his deputy find her and rush her to safety, urgently calling for backup. In the woods, Stephanie is still being pursued by one of Casson's men. Inside the cabin, an enraged Essington fires blindly into the attic, hoping to hit Joe. However, Joe anticipates the attack and skillfully throws an axe, landing it in Essington's head, killing him instantly. Casson circles around the house and finds Joe's injured father in the garage, taking him hostage. He then calls out to Joe, who emerges with an axe, but at Casson's command, he drops it. Without hesitation, Casson stabs Lyndon in the stomach. Just then, the sheriff and his deputy arrive, opening fire on Casson and forcing him back inside the cabin. Joe cradles his father as he succumbs to his wounds. Just as Joe is mourning, he is attacked by one of Casson's men from the woods. However, Stephanie intervenes, shooting the attacker with an arrow. Joe follows up by launching an axe into the man's back before finishing him with another arrow to the neck. Meanwhile, Casson grabs the bag of drugs and makes his way out, shooting one of the sheriffs before loading the bag into his car. The other deputy fires at Casson, who retaliates and flees into the woods. Joe quickly tells Stephanie to find Charlotte, and she rushes off. The second deputy, checking on his injured partner, reassures Stephanie that Charlotte is safe inside the police car. In the woods, Joe takes a different route, trying to cut off Casson's escape. He sets a trap using a rope to throw Casson off balance before tackling him. Grabbing the drug bag, Joe makes his escape. He reaches a snowy clearing and sets up a concealed bear trap, hiding it under the snow. Casson eventually catches up, and they engage in a brutal fistfight. Joe, exhausted and wounded, struggles to lure Casson into the trap. However, Casson notices it and begins taunting Joe, threatening his family. Desperate, Joe steps into his own trap, which is attached to a tree, using it to launch himself at Casson, sending them both tumbling over a cliff. Casson crashes to his death, while Joe, barely hanging on, painfully pulls himself back up. As he regains his footing, he is met by the arriving police, along with his wife and daughter. The ordeal is finally over. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you didn't, feel free to hit the dislike button twice, just to be sure. Make sure to watch the full movie for all the action-packed details. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content.